Oh, quit whining, punks! Dr. Blaxill's back with another competitive battle report from Warhammer the Old World. 2,000 points of my warriors versus Nav the Master Hussain's Goblins. At the moment, competitive Old World reminds me of decking it out with Billy and Jimmy Lee in a seedy arcade this side of the Iron Curtain. It's Double Dragon Central as flying lizards carpet bomb old men's toys back to the under-the-bed shoebox from whence they came. Years of skill and finesse are hideously flattened as dragon surfing rookies pace the high horse riding dragonless pros time and again. What's the solution? Smashing dragons as Ned Ludd smashed the mechanized threshing looms which undercut the comparative advantage of artisanship and reduced his men to brain-dead automatons on the production line of shareholder capitalism? No, punks. There are greater forces at play from the base, and while that lizard reigns supreme today, pressure from above or below is going to clip his wings. As to which, do you have faith in our masters? I think you know what I think. So, on to happier things. It's nearly time for the Twin Sentinels Grant Tournament, which I am co-officiating. The lists are in, and I'm very pleased by what I see. Properly incentivized by our missions, I think we're going to see some outstanding games with a much more varied meta. And what would a grand tournament be without grand prizes provided by our generous sponsors? Our first sponsor is Clockwork Arcana. As well as being purveyors of a magnificent range of merchandise, we have here the QUODOMETER. Intricate, precise and mechanical, much like a pocket watch. Useful not only for counting things like wounds and turn numbers, but doing so in style with a satisfying mechanical click. We have 2 of these QUODOMETERs to give away as prizes. Like the look of the QUODOMETER? The Kickstarter link's in the description. Well, Marmaduke, I'm about to head out now into my club down in the metropolis. Is there anything I've forgotten? Quack, quack, quack! Ah, yes, of course, my QUODOMETER. Perfect for a gentleman out and about town, counting things such as hit points, the number of enemies tracking him, and of course the secret code to get me into the British Embassy should I find myself distressed and disordered. Our second sponsor is MiniMagTray. As you can see, these come in a variety of shapes and sizes, adapted for new base footprints of Warhammer the Old World. The first advantage is that these are invisible. You're not going to have any movement trays sticking out, and for those who like that kind of a look, just simply able to see the bases of the models rather than a movement tray on the battlefield, these are surely a must. We have a bag of these to give away as prizes. The second advantage is one of precision. Ever been in an argument with an opponent about whether you should measure base to base or model to model? Is this an 8-inch charge or a 9-inch charge? Poor old Pierre Mellon here, on his conventional movement tray trying to charge these Forsaken, doesn't know. It's all a toss-up. But smart Madame Marie, investing in one of these new mini-mag bases, can tell that it's exactly a 9-inch charge into those marauders. There you go, punks. The advantage of precision. And last, but by no means least, we have Sarah's Boardgame Solutions. Sarah produces dice-rolling trays and bags in which you can transport them, all with the ability to customize. Perhaps you'll be sensible and put your own name on there for fear of them getting lost. Or maybe you prefer to write the title of your army, the name of your general, or maybe some kind of logo that represents you and your hobby ventures. I've got a discount code here for you punks so you can get 10% off. It's one I thoroughly approve of, namely, Dr. Luke Punks 10. Right, so this is my army for this classic encounter between the Orcs and Goblins and my Warriors of Chaos. We actually played this game as one of 4 that we managed in a single day from an early start all the way to a late evening. Because we were experimenting, as we're continuing to do in Old World, some of our lists were I think a lot more competitive than others. So, what was my army? So my general is Chairman Banderas. He's a Chaos Lord with the mark of Chaos Undivided. He's on a demonic mount. He's got the Ogre Blade, the Paymaster's Coin, a Potion of Toughness and Favour of the Gods. He's no dragon, but he does have the ability to do multiple wounds with his Ogre Blade and has high strength and can go into pretty much any elite or monstrous kind of target. I know Nav likes his Ragnarok spiders, and I fully expect to be facing 2 of them. And with his 360 degree charge arc, I ought to be able to get into pretty optimal combats with this character. Next, for the Magical Spectacular, we've got Lambda Gemfire, level 4 on Demonology. She's got Spell Familiar for a 5th spell, the Infernal Puppet and the Ruby Ring of Ruin. With Chaos, I think it's really difficult to actually not play with Demonology. It's generally a really fantastic lore, and it has one of the most broken spells in the game in Steed of Shadows. Then next we get a little bit more funky, because we've got 2 aspiring champions. They're both identical, they're called Arnold and Omega. Both have heavy armour, a flail and Favour of the Gods. The rationale with these is to give them relatively minimal equipment and keep preying on the Chaos Lord mutation table. Hopefully by the time they get into combat they'll actually have quite a few buffs and so really be quite good. Arnold, meanwhile, has the Enchanting Aura, which is a pretty good Chaos mutational reward. It makes enemies in base-to-base contact with you always strike last. It's one of those little items that perhaps makes infantry a little bit less useless in Old World, because it does at least mean that you'll get to strike first before your guys all die and aren't allowed to step up. It's also particularly powerful if you play those infantry in a certain well-known formation. We'll come to that later. Then we go into core, and I've got 4 units of Chaos Hounds, which will all be run in lines. These pesky pooches run 21 inches in front of an enemy's nose and can be guaranteed to ruin his day. Because it's so stupidly fast, so stupidly undercosted, and can rally and then go wherever it likes, any enemy attempting to perform any basic function in the Old World, whether for rest, play, or travel, will find a dog right under his nose ready to trip over. And then my next core choice is a seemingly sentimental one. 22 Chaos Warriors with the Mark of Slanesh, a banner with the War Banner, and halberds. Ah, Dr. Blaxill, so lovely to see you breaking out your movement tray again. So lovely to see you return to family-friendly ranked-up formations, because of course, it's all the taking path that matters. Right, onto my special. I've got 4 Dragon Ogres with heavy armour, great weapons and a Shartak. This has been my hard-as-nails mainline unit that I've used in Warriors of Chaos thus far. I've then got 2 single Shartaks. This is also a real piece of nonsense for just 69 points. Really strong, destroys enemy chaff, and can even sometimes damage monsters because of its strength of 7. And then finally I've got 5 chosen Chaos Knights. They've got lances, full plate armour, the Mark of Khorne, standard bearer, musician, and drilled. As astute players will know, drilled is a place where there's real power in Warhammer the Old World. The knights start in a conga line, move 24 inches with the marching column rule, and then reform into a picket line, and then smash the enemy in the face with 3 attacks each. Finally, I've got something a little bit fluffy, which is a single Chaos Spawn with the Mark of Khorne. He's for teleporting around with the Steed of Shadows spell. He doesn't have much other purpose, he's pretty useless. Yes, I know you're not actually supposed to be able to do that either, as I later discovered. I don't think you're going to be seeing him again. Right, so what are we facing on the other side? Well, I can't see any orcs. To be honest, I can't see many goblins either. It seems mainly to be spiders and squigs. So, in his hero section, he's got 2 goblin oddnobs, level 4 wizards, both riding Ragnarok spiders. They both got the Law of War, which has got a number of excellent buff spells on, such as Evil Sun Shining and Here We Go. But the real reason for having these wizards isn't so much for their magic, it's because of their combat potential. These spiders have got toughness 6, 10 wounds each and a 4-up armour save. One of the odd knobs has also got a talisman of preservation too, to give it a 5-up ward. These goblin spider characters are complemented by another spider in the rare section. There's also a giant in here to boot, so we've got 4 big thunder-stomping monsters making up the vast majority of points in this orc and goblin army. Apart from that in the army, he's got 3 units of Goblin Spider Riders that are arranged in lines, for more of the same sort of nonsense that the Chaos Hounds are going to be doing to him. What would entertainment be if it wasn't for an audience? And the audience here is a likely redundant infantry block, which is going to be a Goblin squig herd of about 25 strong, who are going to be sitting on one side and watching the carnage unfold with the 4 monsters. These monsters, and especially heroes on monsters with their stacked saves, are the real bee's knees in Warhammer the Old World. They've got so many attacks, so many wounds, can thunderstomp everything, and war machines don't do any damage, and there are precious few spells that can inconvenience them. Really, the only things they're afraid of are other monsters and the dragon-slaying sword, which I don't actually have. Here's a nice look at them, punks. Then they look lovely, all rampaging towards me. The future of goblinoids in Warhammer the Old World. Say hi. Right, so speaking seriously, I do think this is the quite hard match-up for me. 1 monster's fine, 2 can be handled, but 4 of the damn things, and with 2 of them with 10 wounds and toughness 6, that's going to be very, very difficult to shift. Now my general, Chairman Banderas, does have the Ogre Blade, not quite as good as the Dragon Slaying Sword, but still very serviceable. I've also got my Dragon Ogres, which have all got great weapons at Strength 7, and those Chosen Knights as well with Strength 6 on the charge. Of course, I do actually have one other trick up my sleeve, because that redundant infantry block that's there just for sentimental family fun actually isn't a redundant infantry block there for sentimental family fun. That's right, punks! It's time to break out the 4x2 and line up like Comrade Scargill on the NUM picket line. Right, so here's the deployment. You can see my great long picket line taking up only about half of the table on the right-hand side. To their left, we've got a line of dogs, the Chaos Spawn, Lambda Gemfire and a single Dragon Ogre, then another line of dogs, a line of Chosen, a line of Dragon Ogres, and then a line of dogs on the left-hand side next to my General. Over the other side, you can see that Nav doesn't really have that much deployment to speak of, apart from clustering all his monsters on one side of that impassable terrain feature. That's going to have the effect of taking out that line from being able to charge the monsters. However, I do have Steed of Shadows in my pocket though, and so after I think we've disposed of those squigs, we ought to be in a rather good position. Now, one inherent advantage Nav I do think has over me here is that his chaff is of course not vulnerable to being terror-bombed off, whereas mine is. All 4 of his large monsters cause terror, and these Chaos Hounds are not allowed to use the General's leadership, although it can use his rallying cry ability. Therefore, my own attempts to chaff what's coming at me are probably going to be a lot less reliable than his. So, it really is priority number 1 to try to destroy those Forest Goblin Spider Riders, so I can actually pick my charges against his monsters. I think the only matchup that Nav really doesn't want is my General Banderas on his own versus 1 of the spiders. I do think, however, that if we can get that 4-man Dragon Ogre unit or the line of Chaos Warriors into one of those spiders, we ought to be able to dispose of them. Right, Nav wins the roll for first turn and the spiders advance. The only thing that is keeping them back slightly is my General, Chairman Banderas. Nav doesn't want him charging one of the spiders individually, so he's a little bit cautious with them. As they're well out of my dispel range, the Goblin Shaman are able to rattle through a fair range of buffs, including Evil Sun Shining, and here we go. The latter spell in particular is actually quite dangerous because it increases the charge range of the spiders, so I'm going to have to assume he's going to get that before being able to plan where I put my own units. Nav also runs his chaff forwards. Because these Goblin Spider Riders can vanguard, and they're in marching column, they surge forwards. They chaff General Banderas, my Dragon Ogres, my Chosen Chaos Knights, and my single Shartak as well. With those spiders coming up behind, augmented by a phalanx of buff spells, it's going to be problematic for the Chaos in their own turn 1 to decide whether we charge those spiders off or not. On his right flank, Nav decides to not move his units. The squigs are quite happy where they are, playing spectator, and as for those spider riders on the right, I think Nav wants to have a piece of later game chaff in hand. One of those shaman also fires off a magic missile and damages the spawn to the tune of a single wound. Moving on to Chaos turn 1 now, and I've got to decide how to respond to this aggressive play from the Goblins. Because I'm pretty much bereft of shooting with the exception of Lambda's magic missiles, I've really got to deal with those spider riders, because if I don't do it now, they're only going to come and haunt me later when things get even worse. Accordingly, I charge Chairman Banderas into the left column. For the central one, I opt not to, and my Chaos Spawn manages to roll high enough to crash into their flank. The Goblins are forced to hold against both charges. First, because they don't want Chairman Banderas charging the orange spider, which has a level 4 wizard on it, and in the second case, because that Chaos Spawn's got random movement, and so there's no other reaction permitted. As for the rest of my movement, the big news is that Lambda manages to get off Steed of Shadows. The flying picket line moves 24 inches across the table, flying over the impassable terrain feature and plonking itself in front of those squigs and those spider riders. That's going to put Nav under a bit of pressure now. He's going to have to commit to something with his squigs. In the magic phase, Lambda gets a summoning off and blasts 2 wounds off one of those spiders. These are the first steps in a very long march to chewing through these monsters. In the combat phase, the Spawn misses completely with its attacks, and the Spider Riders, despite being hit in the flank, manage to score 2 6s and wipe the Spawn off the map. On the left of them, Chairman Banderas and his horsey liquefy all 6 of the Goblin Spider Riders. Unfortunately, the good chairman fails his overrun test and careers forwards into the middle of no man's land, facing all those monsters. This does, however, panic the spider unit that had disposed of my Spawn, and they flee to the right of Lambda Gemfire. I also should add that one of my other dog units panicked when my Spawn was destroyed. We played this rule wrong. They should have only fallen back in good order rather than actually ran. It's Goblin turn 2, and once again it's 3 greens on the fruit machine as Nav gets all of the buff spells off. In his charge phase, he tries an ambitious long bomb number against my Shartak with his giant. He needs a double 6 to get it, and hey presto, the great man surges forward and smashes into my Shartak. By far the more consequential happening, though, concerns Chairman Banderas. Nav plans to put multiple spiders into this Chaos Lord. The first one charges him, and he has to take a terror test, and horror of horrors, he goes and fails it. I'm then left with a dilemma about whether to use my optional Swift Stride or not. If I do use it, there's every chance that Chairman Banderas will roll high enough to bounce out to the other side of the Dragon Ogres, where he'll be safe behind them. However, if I were to roll really high, that is, a 17 or an 18 and 3 dice, that would be enough to bounce him off the board. My other option would to not be use Swift Stride, but then if I rolled really low and one of the other spiders charged me and then I rolled high on my flea, there'd be a chance I'd go off the board. So even though he's actually terrified and running away, the chairman goes through quite a long process of rational utility maximization on whether to use his Swift Stride or not and make his horsey go a bit faster. In the end, he decides to chance it, and oh no, another disaster, because my dice come up 2 6s and a 5, and the chairman crashes through the Dragon Ogres and off the table and onto the floor. The chairman's gone without as much as saying boo to a goose, and now it's the rest of my army all alone against those 4 monsters. The only good thing that does come of this, though, is that orange spider fails its redirection test, and so it's not able to do anything else to me. As far as Nav's other spiders is concerned, he decides not to charge them. The blue one's content where it is to cast magic. The non-magical purple spider, meanwhile, turns round to face my line. The spiders in front of the line are of course no good as using as chaff, because the line will simply dispose of them and hit the squigs when it overruns. Thus the forest goblins use their huge movement to run round the flank of my line, going right to the right-hand extremis of the table, ready to sweep in and be useful later. For their part, the squigs just decide to sit where they are and try to absorb my charge before Nav counter-charges with his purple Arachnarok. Finally, the 3-man spider unit that was in combat with the Spawn rally and go once again into a marching column right back into the same place they were before. This is why chaff is so good in Warhammer the Old World. It can run and then just rally and then go back to where it was the last time. I really don't think they thought out the implications of this properly. They've made it much harder to charge than it was in 8th Ed, and yet they've made chaff blocking pieces so much better than they were before. In the Goblin magic phase, one of the Oddgits fires through a magic missile against Lambda, and she's very lucky to only lose a single wound. In the combat phase, meanwhile, That Shaggoth does rather a poor job against my Shartak, and both of the Dragon Ogres, the Greater and the Lesser, tie at a wound each. Right, that was an eventful second turn for the Goblins, but now it's time for me to see what I can do. So, the Dragon Ogres charge the chaff that's in front of them. Ultimately, we've got to get rid of that, and I've got to try and use those Dragon Ogres to fight back against these monsters, because in the absence of Chairman Banderas, they're probably the best thing that I've got. We then come to the line, and of course that's gearing up for a charge. Now, Nav is an extremely experienced player and very rarely makes any mistakes, but even he hasn't seen through the full grotesqueness of Linehammer, because actually, despite being smack bang in front of the line is actually in the side of the squigs. The squigs have got no option to hold, and sure enough, the line circumnavigates planet Earth with a colossal atlas-like wheel, taking some of the individual Chaos Warrior units almost 30 inches. Disgusting? You betcha. Legal? Absolutely, because closing the door is free. Anyway, most of the remaining Chaos units are gummed up with this chaff screen. However, I do bring in both my units of chaff. One of them is of course the one that fled when the Chaos Spawn was destroyed, but it manages to rally. Both dog units wing in from the side and park themselves in front of these spiders. Look, I know there's a good chance they're going to be terror-bombed off, but desperate times call for desperate measures. There's always a chance that those spiders will fail their redirection test, and the dogs have still got some chance of passing even on a 6. In the combat phase, my line's 30 attacks decimate the squigs, and none of the pathetic creatures are allowed to strike back. They're thumped by an astronomical margin and explode in a sea of multicoloured confetti. The line overruns, but collides with the impassable terrain feature. In the other combats, the Dragon Ogre block minces the Chaos Hounds. The Giant, represented by the Shaggoth, and I may have called him the wrong thing a couple of times, destroys my Shartak and turns round and faces the side of the line for an outside chance of a potentially devastating charge against it. Moving on to Orc, turn 3. The Giant declares a charge into the side of the line, needing a 6 to get it, and fortunately doesn't. Both the orange and the purple spider declare charges against my dogs that I put in front of them. The left-hand dog unit against the orange spider fails, but the one on the right against the purple manages to pass. In the combat phase, those dogs are roundly flattened by the purple spider. The Dragon Ogre combat, however, is a bit closer. The Dogers manage to inflict 4 wounds on the spiders, whereas the spiders inflict 10 on them. To be honest, I think that was probably about as good as I could hope for, given the spiders were attacking first with all their attacks. However, good as they are, the Dragon Ogres can't stand up to this pasting. They break and are run down by one of the spiders. The orange one, meanwhile, manages to restrain and reform, and faces my chosen Chaos Knights, who have been sitting on their hands for the battle thus far. Chaos turn 3 begins with perhaps one of my last chances to get back into this game, which is going to be the thunderous charge of these chosen knights. Using their drilled rule to redress the ranks, the picket line turns into a conga line, and the elite riders spur their mounts into the orange spider. Meanwhile, the dog unit on the left-hand side of the battlefield managed to rally, and runs back in front of the blue spider that pursued and caught my own Dragon Ogres. My one remaining Shartak, who I haven't mentioned so far in this game, who walked up behind the Chaos Warrior line, turns round and puts himself in front of the Giant. This is partly to protect the flank of my line, because if that Giant gets in there and makes them give ground or indeed fall back in good order, he's going to push them off the board. The wisdom of that strategic sacrifice is evidenced later, because Lambda isn't able to get off the Steed of Shadows, and so that line can barely move, apart from moving a few models into its second rank so it can maneuver past the terrain feature next time. In the combat phase, the Chaos Knights don't let me down, and score 5 wounds on the orange spider. In return, it crushes 3 of them. This thing's stubborn, of course, and it falls back in good order, with the remaining 2 Chaos Knights in hot pursuit. Conceivably, I might be able to destroy that spider in the next turn if those Chaos Knights can just swing. He's only got 2 wounds left. Into Orc turn 4, and this blistering game is already careering towards a bloody finish. The blue spider and the purple spider both crash into the side of the Chaos Knights, so these 2 riders are fighting 3 Arachnaroks. For his part, the giant charges into the Shartak who stood in front of him. There's no magic for the goblins now, of course, because both of these wizards are in combat with my Chaos Knights. In the combat phase, the giant managed to rip apart the Shartak, but he does take a couple of wounds in the process, only finishing off the Dragon Ogre by dint of his Thunderstomp. That giant has only got 2 wounds left. He might be possible for Lambda to kill with a magic missile. In the combat phase, the 2 Chaos Knights are being charged themselves, of course, by these 2 spiders in the flank. However, the rider's high initiative sees them swing at the top of the initiative chain, and they impale the orange spider. That's the first of those monsters I've been able to bring down. Note that this is one of the ones that didn't have a wizard on top of it, however, so it's not worth quite as many points. When the spiders come to attack themselves, it's my turn to have an unbelievable spike on the dice. Somehow, both the Ragnaroks together, as well as their crew, managed to inflict precisely 0 wounds on the Chaos Knights, and one of the Chaos Horses impudently also kicks the blue spider in its face and makes it drop a wound. The combat thus concludes in an unlikely draw. Now it's time for Chaos turn 4, and there's very little left on this battlefield. Lambda Gemfire manages to power through Steed of Shadows on the line, and once again it swings round the impassable terrain feature like the hands of a great clock. It's now right on top of those 2 spiders. If somehow those Chaos Knights could repeat that heroic performance of the last combat phase, these goblins are going to be in big, big trouble. Come the big combat phase, one of my Chaos Knights challenges out one of the Goblin Wizards. However, unfortunately, these riders have already had all of the luck that they're going to be given by the Chaos Gods, and the 2 rampant arachnids stamp them into a paste. Fortunately, both of them passed their overrun tests, which would have got them in a bit of trouble. They'd have both had to overrun directly forwards into each other, and right into the jaws of my line. It's then Orc turn 5, and rather than turning to facing the line of doom, Nav actually elects to run his spiders away from it. If he were to charge it, he would be striking last, of course, because of that magic item that one of my aspiring champions has got, and he doesn't want to risk it, given also his spiders are damaged. You might reflect that if this was a conventional ranked-up infantry formation, there would be absolutely no reason for the Orcs to do this, because it would provide exactly 0 threat to the spiders. But here in a line, augmented by those magic items, it is at least able to make these heroes think twice. The remainder of this game can really be very briefly summarised. The spiders try some magic missiles on Lambda, and thanks to a few close calls and some lucky ward saves, she managed to survive. For her part, she also, using her own magic missiles and her high manoeuvrability thanks to being on a horse, managed to get off 2 magic missiles that burned the giant to a crisp, netting me a few more points. And with that stalemate situation, with the line of doom staring right back into the face, having circumnavigated the battlefield from where I started it, and the spiders on my table edge, this game came to an end. Right, it's time to get a cup of tea, count up the points, and see who's won. Right, after counting them up, it transpired that Nav was able to hold on to the skinniest of skinny wins. I had all my Chaos Warrior unit, Alan, Omega, and Lambda still alive. He just had his 2 massive spider heroes still on the table, but they were worth almost half the points of his army. To be honest, given Chairman Banderas had fled off the table in turn 2 and taken with him the Ogre Blade and the best chance of damaging those monsters, I think this was actually a pretty respectable exercise in damage limitation from the Warriors of Chaos. I think Lambda pulled me out of the fire here quite often. She was able to shut down a lot of the goblin magic with her infernal puppet, and she was very good at getting Steed of Shadows off herself. That enabled my line to exert the pressure that it did and prevented those monsters running away with things. To be honest, I've often found in competitive Old World, when playing these massive heroes on monsters, that I'm able to keep them away from my army or chaff them for a lot of turns in the early game. And then sometimes I just simply run out of it, and then the monsters are so powerful that they're able to roll your whole army in just a turn or 2 when they really cut loose. In this case though, my line managed to force these heroes into some kind of stalemate. Right, so thus endeth, at least in online battle reports, the second game of competitive Old World. What did you think of it? Did you think those 4 monsters were an optimal build for the goblins? How'd you rate the performance of my line? Where are we going with Old World? Is it all just going to be heroes, big monsters, skirmishers and lines? Or is there something else in town that we've not spotted yet? On the subject of Warhammer the Old World meta, I'd like to point you in the direction of an interesting site I found on exactly that, called MetaHammer. So you can go on there and look at all of the lists that people have been taking to tournaments and the ones that have been doing well. Now, a resource like this is a little bit like an early map of this primordial soup of a new age of evolution that we find ourselves in, so check it out. I think you'll find it useful. I should say that meta's not everyone's cup of tea. In many ways, I think the world was a better and more beautiful place before all this appeared. But now, this is the brave age of the internet, and wishing it away is a bit like wishing we had democracy without political parties. The wise man, however, looks at meta not with the intention of copying it, but in outmaneuvering it. And then perhaps when all is said and done, the wisest man of all stays out of this catfight and looks at the meta only so he can ignore it. Alright folks, I hope you enjoyed that battle with all of its perversities. See you next time, punks, for more competitive fantasy. Good night.